Hey everyone, back again with another React tutorial, and in this session we will look into React hooks concept known as the useMemo. In the previous videos we discussed about other React concept known as the useState and the useEffect. In this video we are going to extend the same React hooks concept using useMemo. This useMemo is going to be a performance optimization hook, or in other words, we majorly go for using useMemo hook in our React project to prevent unwanted re-renders. So this is going to be quite interesting topic. Therefore, without any further ado, let's get started with the video. First, let's start with the basic syntax of using useMemo. Here we have a simple React project up and ready. Inside the app.txt file, we have an app component. Inside this app component, let's try to define a simple syntax for useMemo. The syntax for useMemo is going to be quite similar to the useEffect. It is going to accept a calculation function as a first parameter and a list of dependency array as a second argument. The only difference between useEffect and useMemo is that useEffect returns undefined. Rather, useMemo is going to return as a value. So let's try to grab that value inside a constant variable. And inside this useMemo, I'm going to have a console log statement, and I'm going to return an integer value, say for example 1. Here inside the div element, right after this text, I'm just going to render the return value. So this is going to be a basic example of how to use useMemo. So once you refresh this app, you will notice that we have the console log statement inside useMemo being printed. And as a return value, the same is also printed right after this text. So this is going to be the basic syntax or an example of how to use useMemo. We have a simple function which returns a value, which is wrapped inside the useMemo hook. And inside the div component, I'm just going to render the return value. And as you can see here in the UI, the return value is 1. And we are going to get the same being printed right after the app text. So with this, we can infer that we don't need to explicitly call useMemo in order to make it executable, because the useMemo executes automatically without the need for triggering or calling that function. So that is one signature feature what we have in useMemo. With this example, we got the basic idea of how to use useMemo. Now let's dive deep into the differences between other React hooks concept and this useMemo, and also we will discuss about when to use this useMemo in our React projects. Now let's try to understand the difference between useMemo and useEffect. To understand it better, let me create a useEffect here. And inside this useEffect, I am going to have a console log statement stating inside useEffect. So basically we are having useEffect and useMemo inside this app component. And we have a corresponding console log statement inside each of those React hooks, right? And if I refresh this page, you will notice that we get the useMemo getting printed first and then the useEffect. No matter how many times you refresh this page, we are going to get in the same order. The reason is that useMemo gets executed even before useEffect. No matter where the function is being placed inside the app component, this useMemo is going to be triggered before useEffect. So the hierarchy would be useMemo will be executed first, and then the DOM component, and then the useEffect. So this is the basic flow of how the React compiles. Here let me have a console log statement inside this return. Though it is not going to be best practice, just for the understanding purpose, I have made a console log statement inside this return. So if I refresh this page, you will notice that the React proceeds in the same way which we have explained earlier. So it executes the useMemo first, and then it executes the DOM components, and finally it executes the useEffect. This is going to be the flow no matter how many times you refresh this page. So apart from the return value and the memory optimization techniques, this is one other difference which we have with useEffect and useMemo. Well, in the previous example, we discussed about the basic differences what we have between useEffect and useMemo. Well, now let's try to dig deep into when to use useMemo in our React project. Here inside this basic app component, let's try to create two state variables named counter1 and counter2. And similarly, we are going to have two functions which handles the increment of counter1 and counter2, after which let's create a function called the heavy function. And inside this function, we are going to create a manual delay with the help of while loop. Then inside the return statement, we are going to call that heavy function. And following which, we are going to create a button component, and inside the onClick event of that button, let's pass the handle counter1 function. Following which, let's create another similar button which will increment the counter2. If we refresh this page, you will see that whenever you increment counter1, there is a slight delay in the increment of counter. Similarly, if I click counter2, there is a slight delay in the incrementation. The reason is that whenever the state changes, the JXS components gets re-rendered all again. And that is the reason, no matter whether you click counter1 button or counter2 button, this heavy function is getting called every time. Since you are going to mimic a heavy task with the help of manual delay using while loop, even if you increment counter1 or counter2, there is a delay in the incrementation process. So in order to overcome this scenario, we can get the help of useMemo. So this is the place where the useMemo comes in handy. All you need to do is just simply try to wrap this function inside useMemo. And in the dependency array, I am going to give counter1 because the counter1 is the only variable that is being used inside this function. And this time, you will notice that there is a delay in increment counter1. But if you notice, whenever you click increment counter2, there is no delay in the incrementation process. The reason is that only when the counter1 changes, this function is going to get executed, which in turn is going to create a delay. Rather, the counter2 incrementation process is independent of this entire function. So we don't need to call this function all again when the counter2 increments, and hence we are not getting any manual delay whenever we increment counter2. So this is one other scenario where you can go for using useMemo to prevent unwanted recalculations of heavy tasks. Now let's look into how to extend useMemo with the help of memo function to prevent unwanted re-renders of multiple JXS components. Here we have a simple app component. Inside this component, let's create a state variable called the counter with the initial value as 0. And let's create an event handler called handle increment that is going to increment the counter value by the factor of 1. And inside the return statement, we are going to print the counter value, and upon every button click, we are just simply going to increment the counter value, along which we are going to have another function called the home page that is going to take the counter as the argument. And this home page is nothing but a simple component where we are going to render the text home page followed by the counter value which is passed as the props to this home page component, right? So this seems to be simple. If you notice that if I click this increment counter button, the home page gets re-rendered. The reason is that every time the state changes, the counter value which is passed as the props to this home page gets altered. Since the props gets altered, this home page is getting re-rendered again, and that is the reason you see this homepage rendered text being displayed in the console whenever I click this increment counter button. So this seems to be logical, but say for example, if I have another state, say counter2, and we have another handler called handle increment 2 that is going to increment counter2 value, and a similar button which when click is going to increment counter2. Alright. This time, if you refresh this page, when you click counter1, the home page is getting re-rendered. And also, if you click this counter2 value, you will notice that the home page rendered text is getting called again, which means that this home page component is getting re-rendered. But the value which we pass as a props to this home page is counter1. But whenever you click increment counter2 value, this home page is getting re-rendered, which doesn't seems to be logical. So what happens here is, though the handle increment is going to increment the counter2 value, this app component entirely is getting refreshed no matter whether you increment counter1 or counter2. Since the app component is getting refreshed, though the counter value what we pass as a props to this home page, even if the value is going to be same, it is treated as a new value. And that is the reason this home page is getting triggered even if you click increment counter 2. And in order to overcome this is what we get the help of memo. All you need to do is to prevent this home page to get re-rendered, simply just wrap this home page with a memo. This time, if you refresh this page and if you increment counter 1, you see the home page is getting re-rendered. And if I click increment counter 2, the value is getting incremented, but the home page is not getting re-rendered again. Because the props what we pass to the home page is only counter 1 and it is independent of state changes happening to counter 2. So this is one another example where we typically go for using useMemo in order to prevent unwanted re-renders of multiple JXS components. Here we have another interesting example where we can go for using useMemo. Inside this app component, let's create a state variable called the number with the initial value as 0. And inside the handle increment, we are just simply trying to increment the number value by the factor of 1. Additionally, I am going to create another dummy object variable that is going to hold an object containing name and ID. Alright, so this is just a simple variable which is initialized with some value. We have another function called getNum, and inside that function, I am going to have a console log statement. Inside the return statement, I am going to have a button which when click going to increment the state variable number. Finally, this getNumber function is just going to return an integer value, say for example 1. And that is going to be just rendered in the UI screen. Alright, if I refresh this page, you will notice that we get number 1 and the increment counter button. Now if we see that each time when I increment the counter, the function is getting called. Now what I need to do is, I need to only call this function whenever this value of dummy object gets altered. And to do that, with the previous knowledge, we try to simply wrap this getNumber function with the help of useMemo. So let's try to do the same here. And inside the dependency list, I am going to pass dummy object. And this time, believing that this function will get called only when the dummy object changes. Since we are not changing this dummy object whenever the increment counter is pressed, we are sure that this function will be called only once. So that is the previous knowledge we have while discussing useMemo. Let's see how it works. If I refresh this page, and you notice that each time I click this increment counter button, I get this function getting called again. Even though it is being wrapped inside useMemo and we have provided the dependency array as the dummy object, we are getting this console log statement printed. Moreover, this dummy object is retaining the same value no matter whether we change the state of number 1. So what happens here is, though the value inside this dummy object is going to be same, it is not treated as the same object whenever the app gets refreshed. Only the value inside this object are same and not the object itself. So that is the reason each time whenever you increment the counter value, this app component gets refreshed and this dummy object is being reinitialized with the same value but with a different object. No matter if you give the dummy object as a dependency array, it is going to be new object every time whenever the app refreshes. So in order to overcome this, we can go for wrapping this entire object with the help of useMemo. And the dependency array, I am going to give it as onMount. So whenever this component gets mounted for the very first time, this dummy object variable will be initialized with this object containing the value name, alias and ID as 1. And this time, no matter how many times you increment this counter, you are not going to get this console log statement getting printed. Hence, this is one other scenario where you can go for using useMemo to overcome the limitation of object comparison in React. Well, these are the basic differences of useMemo and how and when to use useMemo in your React projects. Hope you found this video useful. If you do so, consider subscribing and I will see you again in the next one.